So it is absolutely an honor to be back on this stage again. I was thinking earlier today to 4 years ago, the first time that I got to come to Lead Dev London. And in thinking back on what's happened in my career over the last 4 years, that was a watershed moment for me, to realize that there was a whole crowd of people in the world that cared about engineering management and doing it really well. And so I am thankful that this event exists, and I am thankful that we all get to spend some time together today. So let's start out with a hand for Mary and the organizers for putting on such a great event. So like Mary said, I'm a senior engineering manager at GitHub, and I'm incredibly grateful that they've given me the time to be here with you today. If you've gotten an alert or an automated pull request for a vulnerable dependency on one of your repositories, that's work that the wonderful humans I work with at GitHub do, and I would love to hear your thoughts on any of those features. I also have a bag full of stickers, so if you have a shortage of GitHub stickers in your life, come find me. I will happily share them. So like Mary said, I love to tell stories. And that's what I'm doing right now, because we've all had just a mind-blowing amount of amazing information given us today. So at the end of the day, it's nice just to sit back and relax and enjoy a story, and that's what I aim to give you. So I'm going to start. If you've ever been to Paris, and most of you probably have given the proximity, if you've ever been to Paris, you remember the moment that you first spotted the Eiffel Tower. Maybe it was out your plane window. Maybe it was peeking over the buildings in the Jardin des Tuileries. It probably gave you chills that said, I'm really here. I'm really in Paris. Even if you've never been to Paris, you likely still recognize the Eiffel Tower anytime you see it in print or on film. It's the emblem of Paris and of France, and it's almost universally recognized. Well, this past summer, when I was over for Lead Dev last year, actually, I had the amazingly good fortune to find myself standing in front of the Eiffel Tower with my family. Now, I'm not normally one to foist a family vacation photo on a room full of strangers, but this picture my wife took of my then 7-year-old son, Holden, is one of my favorite pictures in the whole world. We had just finished a picnic on the Champ de Mars, pizza and really nice champagne, like you do. And my son pulled out his trip notebook. He had been drawing these pictures everywhere we went. But he took a long time drawing the Eiffel Tower. This was his third iteration, his third drawing that he did in the span of about 30 minutes, because he just wanted to get it right so badly. And the Eiffel Tower does this to you. It pulls you in. It makes you pay attention. Now, I knew a little bit of the history of the tower already, but as I sat there watching my son draw, I found myself looking up at the tower and wondering about the circumstances that brought it into existence. When it was completed in 1889, the Eiffel Tower, at 300 meters, roughly 1,000 feet tall, became the tallest structure in the world by almost doubling the height of the just completed Washington Monument. How did Gustave Eiffel build something so tall using late 1800s technology? Why build such an ostentatious statement piece in the first place? Well, to answer those questions, we need to know a little bit about French history. Just a little, I promise. This is Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was elected as the president of France in 1848. And at the end of his 4-year term, he decided that he wasn't ready to go. And so he threw a coup for himself and declared himself the emperor. Now, the French people weren't exactly thrilled about being under an emperor again. Most of them wanted a republic. But Bonaparte led France into a period of prosperity that made the people reluctant to revolt. They just couldn't be bothered to stage an uprising. They were too happy and enjoying themselves too much. That prosperity ended abruptly with the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Napoleon picked a fight with Prussia, part of modern-day Germany, to the north to counter their growing influence and power in the region. He bit off way more than he could chew, though, and he was captured in a massive defeat at the Battle of Sedan on September 4th, 1870. And you can see our friend Napoleon here in the middle handing over his sword after losing the battle. It was an embarrassment for him and an embarrassment for France. Well, after the capture of Napoleon, the French set up a new Republican government, and its first job was to get the Prussians to go home. They really wanted to annex some French territory after winning this war, and the only way the French got them to leave was by paying huge reparations to Prussia. Those reparations plunged France deep into debt. The prosperity was gone. Not only were they broke, but their defeat in the war was a huge blow to the collective French ego. Well, fast forward 10 years. By the early 1880s, 10 years later, France was nearly back on its feet. It had largely recovered from the defeat and subsequent reparations after the Franco-Prussian War. And the Republican government enacted after Napoleon III's defeat had held its own against plenty of challenges and was guiding France back into prosperity. And what's more, the 30-year renovation of Paris by Georges-Eugène Haussmann, replacing Paris's traditional narrow medieval streets with broad tree-lined avenues like this one named after him, was nearing completion. Paris was ready to show off. And what better way to do that than to put on a World's Fair? Prince Albert, the husband of Britain's Queen Victoria, had had the idea in 1851 to invite all the nations of the world to come to London and show off their industrial progress. The French liked the idea so much, they hosted one of their own 4 years later in 1855. And then again in 1867. And then again in 1878. 8 years after Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Sedan. Now, the 1878 exposition was meant to mark the French recovery from the war, but the French were still so embroiled in domestic politics that they really didn't start preparing for this exhibition until about 6 months before it started. The whole thing was a bit of a shambles. And so in the early 1880s, a movement to host yet another World's Fair in France was picking up steam. An organizing committee was formed to start making preparations, and the first thing they did was to pick a date. And what better date than the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille? Now, the storming of the Bastille is the symbolic start of the French Revolution, and it's celebrated every year in France. So the 100th anniversary of this was a big deal. Each of the exhibitions held in Paris had been more grandiose than the last. So the committee also announced a competition to design and build a spectacular centerpiece monument for the fair. And that competition got the attention of these two gentlemen, Maurice Coquelin and Émile Nouguier, two structural engineers at La Compagnie des Établissements Eiffel. The two of them had just finished working together on the beautiful Garabit Viaduct. At 407 feet above the Truyère River below it, it was the highest bridge in the world when it opened in 1884. That's a tall bridge for 1884. They had the idea of using the exact same engineering principles to build a giant tower as the centerpiece for the exposition, and so they got to work. And this sketch by Maurice Coquelin is what they came up with. You can see the sketches of a few famous objects on the right to show the scale, the Notre Dame, the Statue of Liberty above it, the Arc de Triomphe. They were proposing a tower 300 meters tall, 100 feet, the tallest structure in the world. Coquelin and Nouguier excitedly took the sketch to their boss to pitch. And as you may guess from the company name, their boss was none other than Gustave Eiffel. Now, Eiffel had been a bit lukewarm on the whole competition. His firm had just finished the Garabit Viaduct after all, and he was looking forward to a little bit of a break, not another big project. What's more, his beautiful city, Paris, kept spending money on these grand exhibitions. They built a ton of beautiful buildings, and then as soon as it was over, they would tear them all back down. Eiffel liked to build things of significance, things that would last. The design competition had a requirement that the centerpiece monument be easy to dismantle, and that was a complete non-starter for Eiffel. Coquelin and Nouguier had hoped to change his mind and get him excited about the competition with the grandioseness of their idea, but it didn't work. It wasn't enough. And so Coquelin and Nouguier got this guy involved, Stephen Sauvestre. He's Eiffel's chief architect, and he suggested several modifications to the design to make it more useful and more aesthetically pleasing. And if you look carefully at Coquelin's drawing, you can see the modifications that Sauvestre sketched in pencil. There's a glass observation pavilion on the first deck. And then at the top of the tower, there's a cupola containing another observation deck and capped by a French flag. In the final design, you can see the 3 observation decks, as well as the lace-like decorative arches that the tower is known for, also suggested by Sauvestre. Now this got Eiffel excited. A tower where people could view all of Paris from heights previously reserved to balloonists? It would be possible to do weather observations and make radio transmissions from such a high point. And so he bought the design patent from Coquelin, Nouguier, and Sauvestre and began the hard work of getting the design selected. Now, the idea was immediately popular with the French public. They just loved the idea of dwarfing the just-completed Washington Monument and besting the upstart Americans. It was not, however, immediately popular with the architects, artists, and most importantly, politicians around Paris. And so Eiffel went on the offensive. This was his first writing on the subject, and if you speak French, forgive me. The Tour en fer de 300 mètres de hauteur destinée à l'exposition de 1829. Roughly translated a 300-meter-high iron tower for the 1889 exhibition. Now, this particular copy, which sold at auction in 2015 for just shy of £8,000, was addressed to General Georges Boulanger, a prominent politician who would go on to be the French war minister. But Eiffel was giving copies of this to anybody who would give him an audience. He also went before the Société d'Ingénieurs Civils, the Society of Civil Engineers, to present his idea and stand for questioning. And oh, were they happy to ask him questions. One of Eiffel's chief critics was Paul Planat, the founder and editor of the architectural journal La Construction Moderne. Now, Planat was not impressed with Eiffel's design and felt it was counter to the hard work that Haussmann had done to beautify Paris in the Great Renovation. Specifically, in the May 1st, 1886 issue, he said, "Eiffel's design is nothing more than an inartistic scaffolding of crossbars and angled iron. It looks hideously unfinished." Pierre Tirard, a powerful politician who would go on to become the French prime minister, decried it as anti-artistic, contrary to French genius. It's a project more in character with America, where taste is not yet very developed, than Europe, much less France. Charles Garnier, a prominent French architect, led the most famous protest against Eiffel's tower, forming the Committee of 300. One member for each meter of the proposed tower's height. Really cute, right? And it was made up of some of the most prominent figures in the arts and architecture in Paris. In their protest, published in prominent Parisian paper Le Temps, said in part, "Imagine for a moment a giddy, ridiculous tower dominating Paris like a gigantic black smokestack, crushing under its barbaric bulk the Notre Dame, the Tour Saint-Jacques, the Louvre, the Dome of les Invalides, the Arc de Triomphe. All of our humiliated monuments will disappear in this ghastly dream." He had a bit of a flair for the dramatic. But it was around this time that Edouard Lacroix was named Minister of Trade and put in charge of the exhibition, and therefore wrapping up the design competition. Lacroix had been among those that Eiffel had lobbied with his paper. And despite the protests of the artists and architects, he and the rest of the political class were really coming around to this idea of building a tower that was twice as tall as the ones that the Americans had built. And they quite liked Eiffel's way of doing this. And so in calling for final proposals, Lacroix amended the guidelines to call for a tower of at least 300 meters in height and suggested that, maybe it might be built of iron. Obvious nod to Eiffel's design. Now, some of the other final entrants to the design competition included a 300-meter tall lighthouse built of granite to signify the Enlightenment of Paris, which would have been much too heavy to ever build. It would have crushed itself under its own weight. Another was a 300-meter tall water sprinkler, in case Paris ever plunged into drought so that they could water these new gardens that Haussmann had just installed in the Great Renovation. My favorite, though, was a nod to the fact that this would be the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. To honor that, someone proposed a 300-meter tall guillotine. In the end, though, Eiffel's design was the only one that was at all practical or even possible to build. And so on June 12, 1886, Lacroix gave an overjoyed Eiffel the news that his design had been selected. That joy was short-lived, however, as the government balked at Eiffel's estimate of 6 million francs, about 800,000 pounds, for building the tower. The government had originally committed to fund the full tower, but quickly backtracked to an offer of only 1.5 million francs, about a quarter of what Eiffel thought it was going to take to get it done. And so Eiffel would need to secure investors for the remaining 4.5 million francs, and to do that, he needed to be able to make money from the tower. And so he requested two provisions from the French government. Number one, that he be allowed to charge admission for going up the tower above and in addition to the money that people had already paid to get into the fair. And number two, that the tower remain intact for 20 years, not the 1 year it was originally slated for, so that he would have more time to make his money back. The government agreed in principle, but this created another problem. You see, the exhibition was to be held on the Champ de Mars in the 7th arrondissement, just south of the Seine River. The Champ de Mars was the French army's primary drilling ground, and Eiffel had proposed to put his 1,000-foot tower right in the middle of the Champ de Mars. Now, the army was already resigned to losing their drilling ground for the year that it would take to assemble and host the exhibition. This happened every time the French government got this wild hair and decided to do this. It couldn't be avoided. But having a gigantic tower in the middle of their drilling ground for 19 years after the exposition, well, that just wouldn't do. And so after much negotiating, it was agreed that the tower would instead be located here, in the northwest portion of the Champ de Mars, near the bank of the Seine, leaving most of the field open for military drilling once the rest of the exhibition was dismantled. Now, Eiffel knew that this would complicate his foundation, but he had little choice but to compromise if he wanted to get the tower built. French bureaucracy being what it was, it took another 6 anxious months for the contract to be finalized and the funding to be put in place. But finally, on January 8, 1887, Eiffel had a signed contract in his hand. He immediately began gathering supplies and hiring workers, and on January 28, 1887, Eiffel's workers began work on the foundation. They had a little over 2 years until the planned opening of the exposition. Now, I mentioned that moving the tower closer to the Seine complicated the foundation work, and here's what I mean by that. Each leg of the Eiffel Tower rests on 4 6.5-foot slabs of concrete, one for each of the principal girders of each leg, so there's 16 of these in total. The east and south legs of the tower rested on solid ground on the Champ de Mars side of the site. The west and north legs, though, were far more complicated because they were on the side of the site closest to the Seine. The ground there was made of millions of years of sediment deposit from the river, much less stable. And so each of the 4 slabs for the 2 legs on that side of the site required 2 piles to be driven 72 feet into the ground to hit bedrock. Then, once they had done that easy little task, they had to build the 6.5-foot thick foundation slabs below the water table of the Seine. So water infiltration was a huge problem for them. And this is how they solved it. Eiffel and his team used these giant 50 by 20-foot cast iron caissons. And these started at the surface, and as they dug out the foundation, they slowly sunk into the ground. And as they sunk into the ground, they filled them with compressed air to keep water from infiltrating their construction site until they had poured the concrete and it was dry and cured. 5 months later, on June 30th, 1887, the foundations were finished. And this is what the foundation for each of the 4 legs looks like when it was completed. Each foundation pier has 2 bolts embedded into it to bolt the shoe of the primary girder. And the bolts look kind of small in this picture, but they're about 4 inches in diameter and 25 feet long. So they are not small. And as soon as this was done, Eiffels' team quickly began the ironwork. And you can see here how the primary girder is attached to the foundation piers at an angle, which is interesting. And the angle here is actually twofold. It serves 2 purposes. Number one, it takes the vertical load of the tower and allows some of it to be borne vertically and some of it to be borne horizontally, which is really helpful when you're building on river sediment, when you're building on unstable ground. But also remember, this was the tallest thing that anybody had ever built. They thought they knew how much strength they needed to counter the winds 1,000 feet in the air that were going to be buffeting this tower, but they didn't know for sure. And so angling the legs into the ground actually gives the tower more lateral stability and helps it stand up against the winds 1,000 feet in the air. Now, work on the tower progressed quickly in large part due to the precision of the drawings produced by Eiffel's office. In all, there were 1,700 general drawings made and a further 3,629 drawings of specific parts and pieces that were needed to build the tower. Now, in each of these drawings, the position of the rivet holes was calculated down to the 10th of a millimeter, and the angles were calculated down to 1 second of arc, which is 1/3600th of a degree. Incredibly precise. And these precisely drawn parts were then forged and drilled in Eiffel's workshop in Levallois-Perret on the outskirts of Paris and brought to the site via horse-drawn carriage. Henry Ford wouldn't invent his Model T for a few more decades. That's how early we are. Early in 1888, they had reached a critical juncture in the first phase of construction. Because the rest of the tower would rise from the first platform, it was absolutely critical that the 4 legs of the tower be level at the first platform. The tower was so tall that a few millimeters out of true at this point could result in a foot or more of variation at the top of the tower. And Eiffel's plan for dealing with this was ingenious. Each leg was built at a very slightly steeper angle than it needed to be. And we're talking a centimeter or 2 here, so not very much. And then, you can't see it in this picture, but the legs aren't actually resting on that scaffolding that you can see there. At the critical point of support, where each leg meets the scaffolding, there's a sandbox. And the reason the sandbox is there is because it allows them to make millimeter-precise adjustments in the height of these legs. There's a little cork at the bottom of the sandbox. And they would pull the cork out, a little bit of sand run out, plug it up, measure, and repeat that process over and over again until they got all 4 of the legs of the tower level. Once they got them level, all they had to do was join them together with the platform to lock them in place. And so it was on March 20th, 1888, the first and most complicated portion of the tower was completed. They still had 800 feet to go, though, and only a year to do it. As they built up from the first level, it became increasingly complicated to get the parts they needed up to where they were working. And so to solve this, they decided to use the first level platform as a staging area. The way this would work is they had a large steam crane on the first level. Again, internal combustion engines wouldn't become commonplace for a few decades. And so this large steam crane would lift parts from ground level up to the first platform. On the first platform, they built a small railroad, a circular railroad, and they would place the parts on it and just truck them around to whichever leg they needed to haul that part up. And then if you look close in this picture, you can see more small steam cranes up at the very top of the tower, up where they're actually building. And these cranes were mounted to the elevator tracks of the tower, and so they followed the tower all the way up. This was how they got parts from the first level up to where they were actually assembling them. By July, the tower was complete up to the second level, and if you look in the background here, you can start to see the other buildings of the exposition starting to take form as well. At this point, the exposition is slated to start in 8 months, and they still have 600 feet to go. Another issue Eiffel's team had to solve was how to rivet pieces together so far off the ground. The Eiffel Tower was assembled almost entirely by riveting. The prefabricated parts were brought to the tower, hauled up, put into place, and once the crew were certain that they had the assembly right, they would begin the tedious process of driving rivets by hand through all of these precisely aligned holes. Now, a rivet is basically a screw with no threads. It has a head on one side, and it's just a smooth steel shaft. And the way it works is once you've got the rivet in the hole, you form another head on the other side of the rivet to lock the two pieces together. In order to do this, though, you have to heat the rivet up to red hot so that it's malleable. On most construction sites, the way this worked is there would be a central forge heating up the rivets, and there would be rivet boys that would run rivets from the central forge to where they were actually doing the construction in a little tin pail. Obviously, that's not an option here, because if they do this at the Eiffel Tower, by the time the rivets make it up to where they're doing the construction, they're going to be cool again, and they won't be malleable. So instead, they invented these portable forges that they used where they were actually doing the construction. The way this worked, you can see in the foreground here, there's a worker heating rivets up in the portable forge. Behind the beam, there's a worker holding a rivet in place by the head. That's the guy in the middle there. On the left, there's another worker that's holding a tool to shape that second head in the rivet. And then there's a fourth worker that's swinging a hammer to apply the force necessary to mold that red-hot metal into a second head. Now, as the metal cooled, once you'd formed the rivet, as the metal cooled, it would contract, and it forms an incredibly tight bond. It's a very secure way to construct something. But when you're doing it by hand, it gets pretty tedious, and they had to do this 2.5 million times because there's 2.5 million rivets in the Eiffel Tower. In all, at the peak of construction, there were 24-man riveting crews at work all over the tower, and the portable forges would go all the way to the very top, 1,000 feet in the air. With all the really complicated stuff behind them, other than just the sheer height of the tower, the top part of the tower went up quite smoothly. They added about 100 feet each month until they topped the tower out on March 15th, 1889. When the tower was structurally complete, well ahead of the exposition's opening, Eiffel marked the occasion by inviting 15 reporters and Parisian dignitaries to scale the 1,710 steps to the top with him to raise the French flag up top. Eiffel, who you can see in the center here, is said to have remarked at the time, "Gentlemen, the French flag is the only flag in the world with a 300-meter flagpole." Now, the reason they had to climb the stairs is because the elevators weren't ready yet. And this might have had something to do with the fact that they were the most complex passenger elevators ever built. I actually don't have time to tell you about them today, but if you'd like to hear about them, come find me and I'll tell you about the elevators. Well, because of this, the first 30,000 visitors to the tower, including Monsieur Eiffel here on the left, had to climb the 1,710 steps to the top. Despite that, the tower was a huge success. Eiffel was figuratively and literally on top of the world. When it was completed in 1889, the Eiffel Tower at 1,063 feet was the tallest structure on Earth, more than 500 feet taller than the previous record holder, the Washington Monument. The Eiffel Tower is approximately the same height as an 81-story building. It would hold that record as the tallest structure in the world until the Chrysler Building in New York was topped out 41 years later. It held the record for 41 years. No structure built subsequent to that has held the record for that long. It's a remarkable achievement that broke all kinds of new ground. And it's the kind of work that all of us say we want to be doing, right? We want to push the envelope. We want to solve hard problems that no one else has solved. We want to ship amazing software. So what can we learn from Gustave Eiffel that will help us do that? Well, to start, I'm going to try something. I'm going to put a word up on screen. And I want you, without thinking about it, to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to show me your general feelings about the subject. Okay? Everybody get your thumb ready? Okay, here's your word. Lots of thumbs down. A few scattered thumbs up, but lots of thumbs down. Exactly what I would expect. And I'm glad, too, because I don't know what we would do with the rest of our time together this afternoon if you'd all been like, yes, I love politics, it's my favorite. Most of us would prefer just to keep our heads down and write code and lead our teams, right? A study published in the Wall Street Journal back in 2011 asked participants about their approach to office politics, giving them these 3 options. Number 1, it's best to know what's going on, but not to participate directly. Number 2, it's best to stay out of office politics completely. Or number 3, it's best to participate so that you can get ahead. Now, how do you think people answered? Between the group that wanted to stay informed but not participate, and the group that stayed out of things altogether, fully 83% of participants picked an answer saying they did not participate in office politics. So you're not alone. I bet some of us have even left jobs because our jobs were too political, our companies were too political. I know I certainly have. But here's the thing, and it took me way too long to come to terms with this. Every organization is political. You can't escape politics by just moving around enough until you find the right boss or the right company. And the reason is that anytime you have more than one person working together on something, you'll have politics. Because politics is nothing more than how humans share power and make decisions together. That's all it is. That means that doing anything meaningful in your company, whether it's as simple as getting to work on things that you want to work on, or as complex as completely overhauling your company's hiring practices to improve diversity and representation, requires you to understand and participate in the politics of your company. There's no other way to do it. I know. What a positive and uplifting note to end our day on. But stay with me. Politics doesn't have to be negative and gross. There's a couple of things that Eiffel does that give us a great example to follow in doing politics the right way. Let's rewind back to the work that Eiffel did before the tower was built. Remember this paper that Eiffel put together to promote his plan for the tower? He went around from official to official, handing out autographed copies, talking about what he wanted to build. What Eiffel was doing here was pretty simple, just networking and self-promotion. Now, how many of us love networking and self-promotion? I mean, just really love it. It's kind of the same bucket as politics, but they get a bad rap that they don't entirely deserve. Let me reframe these 2 terms for you. A little less intimidating, right? But that's all Eiffel was doing. He would invite somebody to lunch, or more likely to spend an afternoon on the terrace of a Parisian cafe polishing off a bottle of wine together, and he'd tell stories. He'd regale them with tales of building the Garabit Viaduct. He might even tell them that when a train passed, fully loaded, the bridge was only displaced by 8 millimeters, exactly as his mathematical models had predicted. And then he would show them the final drawing of the tower, and maybe talk about how amazing it would be when a tower on French soil passed the height of the great obelisk the Americans had been working off and on for 40 years. He'd listen to their stories too, and by the end of the conversation, he'd have made a friend. Now, importantly, Eiffel didn't just do this with people on the exhibition committee. The fact that this document is autographed to Georges Boulanger tells us that. Boulanger was in government and would go on to be war minister, but he had absolutely no decision-making power for the exhibition. And that's what networking is all about, just making friends. Maybe you'll be in position to help one another at some point, but that's not an immediate focus. So what does that mean for you? Grab coffee with your product manager, so they're a human to you, not someone who drops things in your backlog and sets unrealistic dates. Get lunch with someone in sales, because they're the ones hearing the questions that your customers are asking, and most of them have absolutely no idea how we do what we do. They love to hear us talk about it. The second part, self-promotion, is about making sure others know what you've been working on, not in a braggy way, in an informative way. In a perfect world, doing good work would be enough, but your manager's busy. They're not paying nearly as much attention to you as you think they are, so you have to tell them what you've been up to. Showing what you've been working on and what you've accomplished is a big part of how you build your reputation at work, with your manager and with other folks. If you want a promotion, if you want to build more influence so that you can affect big changes, this is a big part of how you do it. If you want something that will help you learn to do this more effectively, I can't recommend Dale Carnegie's classic How to Win Friends and Influence People highly enough. It's full of timeless advice on how to do this well in a productive and non-scummy way that benefits you and the person you're talking to. It's a very authentic book. For the other thing Eiffel has to teach us, let's go back to the contract he signed on January 28, 1887. If you'll remember, the French government had initially proposed to cover the entire cost of the tower. But at the last minute, they balked and only agreed to cover a quarter of the cost. Now, at this point, it would have been easy for Eiffel to play hardball and demand that the government live up to its original promise, or he would just walk away from the deal. But that's not what he did. Instead, he did a bit of negotiation. Now, this word probably makes you think of buying a used car and trying not to get screwed. So let me reframe it as well. Cooperation. That's really all a good faith negotiation is, working together to find an outcome that works for everyone. Now, Eiffel understood the French government's position, and he had empathy for the government representatives that he was talking to. Putting on an exposition is expensive, and they frankly didn't have the 6 million francs to give him. So instead of walking away, he worked with them to find a way to satisfy his need for 6 million francs to build his tower, and their need to only give him 1.5 million of those francs. And he found that mutually beneficial solution in his being able to charge admission for 20 years. As an aside, that turned out to be a phenomenal deal for Gustave Eiffel. An amazing 1.8 million people ascended the tower during the exposition, and they paid an average of 3 francs for the privilege. So if you do the math, Eiffel had made his money back by the end of the exposition. The rest of the 20 years were pure profit. Now, when we're working for something we want, there's a temptation to see that process as a zero-sum game, right? Someone has to win, someone has to lose. Eiffel needed 6 million francs to build the tower, so it was that or bust. Your executive team wants a piece of functionality delivered by an absurd date, so you need to tell them under no uncertain terms that it's absolutely impossible, can't be done. But in reality, there's almost always a middle ground where everyone gets most of what they want. The trick is figuring out what it actually is that everyone in the situation wants and why they want it. It requires you to exercise empathy and compassion and to ask probing and open-ended questions that help you build understanding. So when your executives start pushing for an unrealistic date, try to understand why. Look to see if there's a smaller piece of functionality you can deliver early that will meet whatever need is driving that push. If you want to learn how to negotiate well, grab a copy of this book, Herb Cohen's classic, You Can Negotiate Anything. Now, the title's a little cheesy, but this book changed the course of my career when one of my mentors recommended it to me years ago. Cohen teaches a style of negotiation that revolves around understanding everyone's needs, especially your own, which is often the trickiest part, and getting to agreement by finding mutually beneficial ways to fulfill them. This book is one of my most important tools as a manager. I use these principles all the time. But what about bad politics? Are there organizations and bosses that are overly political? Of course there are. If you find yourself in an organization that regularly promotes those that play the game instead of those doing good work, you might have to leave. Or if you find yourself working for a boss that always takes credit for your good work, there might not be enough networking and self-promotion to get around that. But if Gustave Eiffel didn't find the French government too political to navigate and to negotiate with, there's a good chance that bar is higher than you think it is. There's another layer we need to consider here as well before I wrap up. Everything I've shared so far has been for us as individuals, but this is lead developer, right? What does this have to do with how we lead our teams? Well, the conventional wisdom around organizational politics for tuned-in leaders who care about their teams is this. Now, I try not to use profanity on stage, but this is such a common term in leadership circles that I'm not sure saying shit umbrella even counts as cursing. But that's the common wisdom around politics and leadership. I'll give you a second to read this tweet from Jason Fried. Basically, what Jason is saying here is you might have to engage in organizational politics to get your job done, but you should shield your teams from politics, which Jason calls bullshit here, so they can keep their heads down and stay productive. Now, there is some truth to this. Constant disruption, getting jerked around from priority to priority, are counterproductive for your team. And helping them stay heads down writing code 8 hours a day will probably feel really productive to them and to you too. But the full reality is more nuanced. The downside of being an impervious shit umbrella is that you become a choke point of information to your team. Over time, you'll disconnect your team from the mission of your organization and think you're doing good things all the time. And since we know that sense of purpose is an important motivator for most humans, that disconnection can quickly lead to dissatisfaction and even leaving your company. What's more, putting yourself in that spot as a leader means you're bearing a burden that no human is designed to bear. You are all but guaranteed to burn out in that position. So what do we do instead? One of the engineers on my team, Steve Rickard, introduced me to an analogy that I like a lot better than shed umbrella. Heat shield. We get the term heat shield from the world of space travel and orbital reentry. Unlike an umbrella, a heat shield isn't designed to be impervious. An umbrella blocks all the rain that hits it, but a heat shield blocks just enough heat to make reentry survivable. It's still pretty warm in the cab of that spacecraft when they're coming through the atmosphere. It's a carefully calculated compromise. If a heat shield blocked all of the heat, it would be too heavy to reach orbit in the first place. Not enough, and reentry isn't survivable. Guess what? This is your job as a leader. You need to block enough organizational noise so that your team has consistent direction and big blocks of time to work, but not so much that they lose context and connection. Blocking all the noise might make them feel comfortable, but it will ultimately keep them from delivering the value that they're capable of delivering. It'll also stunt their career growth because, as I said earlier, all organizations are political. If the folks on your team never have the opportunity to see organizational politics, they'll never learn to build their influence and sell their ideas or negotiate for the things that they think are important. As a leader, you have an obligation to help your teams learn how to navigate your organization. And that's a skill that's going to serve them for the rest of the time at your organization, but also for the rest of their careers. So, what happened to the Eiffel Tower? It's obviously still there. Well, by the end of the 20 years Eiffel had been promised, the tower was too much a part of Paris's global identity to do anything but leave it right where it stood. So at the end of 20 years, it defaulted over to the French government's ownership, and it's still standing right where it was built 129 years later. And while it hasn't been the tallest structure on the planet for a while, it remains the most visited paid monument in the world, with nearly 7 million visitors waiting in line for hours to take in the breathtaking views of Paris it provides. And if you've been to the Eiffel Tower, you know how long those lines get. There are a lot of people that want to go up the Eiffel Tower. Now, had Gustave Eiffel not been willing to participate in the politics involved, we wouldn't have the Eiffel Tower. And the same is true for you. You can choose to keep your head down and hop from job to job every time you get a whiff of politics, but doing that's going to stunt your career. Even if you want to stay on the individual contributor track and become a senior technical contributor, you'll need to understand politics to develop the influence you need to drive technical decisions. Now, if, instead of running, you accept that politics is a reality, neither good nor bad in and of itself, and you learn to participate in organizational politics in a way that remains true to you and the things that you value, you can find ways to have huge impact in your organization and maybe even the world. You can help your teams have the same impact. It may seem intimidating, but you can do it. I know you can. Good luck.